Now for on something that's just a little bit different, and this is kind of fun, but I think it's really helpful for me when I'm thinking about the pathway of the player. So I'd like to talk about the path, and so that is basically the path to the player's goal and how we adjust that path to suit our pacing and to open up gaps between expectation and result. So there's only so many ways you can really twist a path, and I find it really helpful to keep these in mind as I lay out the player's path. So it may take a couple of these before sort of understand what I'm talking about here, but the idea is that as your path continues forward or it goes, you'll reach a decision point, you'll reach a node, and now where does the path go from here? So the first way that it could go is what I'd call a continuance. So continuance is marked by a node along the path. It's a brief stop, and then the path continues in relatively the same direction. Continuance emotionally here, psychologically, confirms the player's previous path. The player has done well to come in this direction. The node marks the accomplishment of one path ending and the outset to another. There may be some shallow exploration options at this continuance node, but it's clear that the path for progression is straight in the obvious direction. Next, a deviation. So a deviation is marked by a node that denies the player's current path direction and offers a slight detour. It still feels like that by taking this path, it takes the player rather in the direction they were headed, but not nearly as directly. The player may mark the change and remember to try to make up for it later by heading back towards the goal a little bit more the next time they have a decision point. Deviations acknowledge the correctness of the player's path, and essentially the player understands this is simply a minor problem on the way to success. Next would be a redirection. A redirection halts all forward movement along the player's path and forces a lateral movement. There's an obstacle in the way that requires circumnavigating it. So the player has a sense that their progress is at a standstill, and it will continue to be that way until they've found another forward path. So it feels like a bit of a stop or a pause on the way to the goal. Next would be a reversal. So reversal, and this is a little hard to convey in a single image like this, but a reversal is a negation of the player's path. It basically the sense of forward progress is completely halted, and now the player actually begins to move farther away from their goal. This path may very well sort of eventually turn back towards the player's intended direction, but for now, it feels like a defeat, and it feels like losing ground. The player might even question if this was the correct way at all. It's all about pacing, but essentially reversals and even a redirection like this. Be careful about using them too early in your pacing, because the player sort of needs acknowledgement of their path before you turn it back to them. It's turn it back on them. It's kind of like the thing of the gap. You have to feel like you're making forward progress before you can start to throw the gap in the way. There needs to be an expectation that you're on the correct path before you can reverse it. So next would be a termination. So a termination is the end destination of the current path. It could be possible that this destination, this is the destination that the player was meaning to find. Obviously, this is not true in this picture if this indeed is the goal. Or more likely, as you see right here, this is a dead end, and the player is forced to retrace their steps. If this is a dead end, then the player's choice in using this path feels like an error. the risk that they were putting for this did not pay off, and the player has lost whatever they invested. Or maybe there's a reward here to be found that, while not sort of progression forward, it offsets the sense of loss. Ending in failure like this is demoralizing. The player might sort of ask if they missed any clues that might have hinted that this was the wrong choice, especially if this cost was significant to come here. Or maybe they might wonder if maybe there's something still to be found in this dead end. Is there a secret passageway? Why did the designer decide to send me here? Why did they even create this path, this corner right here? It has to have a purpose. Next, we've got divergence. So divergence gives the sense that you have sort of two pathways, or more than two pathways, that all lead to the goal. And this is tricky because, depending on the design, a divergence can feel like both decisions will cause the player to sort of miss out on something. So if they go this way, they'll miss this way. And obviously, if they go this way, they might miss things along this path. And that can be a little frustrating for players, especially for people that feel like they want to collect every collectible, people that are completionists. When we were working on Uncharted 4, we really wanted to make our environments less linear than they had been in previous Uncharted's, and one thing we sort of what we struck on was this concept of the wide linear. So essentially paths that seem to diverge, but not for forever, and there's lots of opportunities for changing your minds. So essentially here is an example of divergent paths that keep you separate. And this right here is sort of a model of wide linear that seems to be the most successful that I've found, at least. Essentially here you have two very well-defined divergent paths with lots of crossover opportunities. So if we compare this to essentially this, so this is essentially just as wide of a space as the other, but there's no suggestion here as to the right way to do things, the actual path to our goal. And so this can often lead to sort of players losing their way, getting turned around, possibly actually even coming back the other way and not realizing it. So that's what the advantage of sort of the wide linear concept is that there are paths, but lots of ways to sort of change your mind back and forth. So so this kind of confusion leads us to the next type of path juncture, which I call dissolution. So a dissolution is when the player's apparent path disappears into an ambiguous sort of negative space. The player is suddenly presented with an abundance of choice and maybe even an unclear goal direction. So maybe the player is offered in a dissolution many distractions. So maybe there's many things that sort of draw the player's eye and make them start to forget about, okay, do I really need to find that one goal, or am I more interested in these sort of things? I don't see necessarily a directed path that the player has, or that the designer has sort of drawn out for me. And so it doesn't really feel like there's any sort of path that I can kind of go any which way I want. What is my goal and what is the best way to get there? So the player is given a lot of agency to answer that question, and typically in an open space there are less occluders and stuff like that, and to block line of sights to prominent landmarks and goals. So another sort of almost variation on a dissolution is an obfuscation. So this is a slightly different take in the fact that we do have a lot of divergent sort of, pathways, but essentially the point here is to cause the player to sort of lose track of the true path and the true goal, just like a dissolution, but the obfuscation sort of complicates things by further reducing sort of the sight lines, so it's not clear where the goal is and where the path is. Next node is the what's called a convergence. So a convergence is when two or more paths meet and continue on one path. So this would be sort of the end of a path dissolution, coming from sort of an ambiguous space to a well-defined one, essentially. And this is one of the more challenging for designers because, with a path convergence, it's really hard to communicate to the player which path is the true way forward. If the player came from this direction, why do they choose this way instead of choosing this way? So often players might become confused about what may seem like other interesting or profitable paths. So that is pathway junctions, and I hope that that's helpful and essentially putting your levels together and feeling out how you can sort of pace the player's path to their goal and their journey. So that then brings us to this week's assignment.